Well, hello, I'm David Willey. I'm the curator at the Tank Museum. Obviously not at the Tank Museum, but this is the first of one of those improvised chats we're going to be trying to do so we can still feed out, hopefully, some interesting content. Now, we asked you, one of the questions we asked was what sort of things might you like to know about, hear about, what might be able to do. I'd repeat, we haven't actually got access to the Tank Museum and its collections at the moment, so that in the ideas of getting inside tanks, etc., is going to be problematic. We can't really do that, so we can't be on site. So what we're going to try and do is whatever we can answer. It'll be me here, probably at home, or maybe we'll see what other people can come up with as well. But one of the questions that was asked was something about one of those areas that often gets overlooked in military history, but because we like all the kit, don't we? We're the Tank Museum, we've got the end product. But one of those areas, which is how do you keep that kit going? Logistics, as it would be called, supplies, as it was in the old days. And one of the obvious ones is how do you keep a tank going, or an armoured vehicle, or really any motorised vehicle in the military? Is the obvious one is you're going to need fuel. And that history of how the fuel can has developed and been used, again, I've been trying to quickly gen up and finding out all sorts of interesting little bits and pieces. So this little session, we're going to look at some fuel cans. Now, here in Britain, in the very early days of ordering petroleum, you actually went to a chemist to do that. You actually got your petrol from a chemist. But the numbers of companies that were making it were very few. And the range of it and some of those mixes became quite problematic, which is why you start getting this idea of branding only by ours. And when they were starting to sell petroleum, they start selling it in sealed containers. So you knew this was it, only by a sealed container, etc. And then we get all the branding that gets stuck on the outside. Now, traditionally in Britain, fairly quickly, a company that was based in Hackney that actually patented the word petrol, which is why you actually see some of the other countries calling things like spirit, benzene, etc. Other names start coming in to be other than petrol. But the company in Hackney ended up starting, and they were a major seller, and they start selling fuel in what becomes the standard 2-gallon can. Now, here's a later example of that. The idea of the 2-gallon can, it takes off. Some are very plain. This is a military one, I think. It's got no advertising on it at all. It just says across the top, petroleum spirit, highly inflammable, stamped in it. Some later, because they were fixed on the side of running boards of cars, they start getting embossed, they start looking much grander. Some had advertising literature actually stuck on as a paper. On the whole, most of these ones end up with a brass cap, and the idea of the brass cap here with lugs on the top, so you can actually, if they get stuck, you can lever them off, or you can have a tool for that. The brass cap is to stop any risk of, as I tighten it up there, probably making all the sound effects, the brass is to stop any chance of a spark. And again, that's another one of the things you have to think about with petroleum all the time, is the high risk fuel and the risks of setting it on fire, causing flames, fire, and the vapour to ignite. But this type of can was in use in Britain well up into the 1940s. Only in the 1920s do we start seeing curbside petrol stations and pumps coming into operation. So you tended to, for early vehicle owners, you ordered in your cans. Quite often, how it works is you just pay for the petrol that's inside, and you're actually paying a deposit for the can. You get that money back when you hand it in, or you refill, etc. So technically you didn't really own the can. In Britain, there was ended up 300 to 400 different brands, manufacturers, suppliers. And one thing I did find out, just by looking up on this subject matter, the collector's market for these is obviously, like with so many, automobile memorabilia, etc. There's a huge collector's market. But the British versions of all these are much easier to get hold of because, of course, in Europe, when the Second World War came along, these were the types of things that were very quickly impounded or taken by the military, or were lost or got rid of in scrap drives if they weren't needed anymore. So actually, there's a much bigger collector's market for these in Great Britain than there is in the rest of Europe, just simply because of the numbers that survived, being an island that wasn't actually invaded. Now, as war approached in Britain, they came up with something that ends up being called the flimsy. It's a 4-gallon can, and it's done in a dissimilar manner to this one. It's larger and square, so in that way it looks similar, but it is almost just like a biscuit tin. The argument behind it was these are quite relatively expensive to manufacture, and the military saw these next 4-gallon tins as almost being disposable. You were supposed to backload them if you could, but because they were made of a very thin metal, they were square-edged on the hull, which meant that often got damaged, those square edges where the welding were or where the seams were. They almost look like tin plate. That's why I mentioned the word biscuit tin. Think of old types of biscuit tins. That's kind of how they looked. And the issue about them, because they were so flimsy, they ended up getting the name flimsies. That's what they were called by British soldiers. Now, normally those 4-gallon tins were put two together in a little bit of a wooden framework for transportation. But they had huge issues with the loss of petrol because they were so flimsy. As soon as they started getting damaged, there's a wonderful account of where some of them were being shipped, and they realised quite quickly that even just with the rolling motion of the sea on the boat, these flimsies were being punctured, splitting on their seams, etc. And they got to the point that when they opened the ship's hold, the fumes were so strong they had to come up with a system where they actually dropped down some sailors on a platform from one of the derricks, dropped them in there to grab enough of the fuel cans they thought were still together, pull them out quickly before they were overcome with the fumes, and then another team took over, had another go. Well, the first team took a breath of fresh air, as it were. That's how bad some of this was. And I'm going to read you from that wonderful wartime journalist, Alan Moorhead, whose books, again, I'd strongly recommend reading them. This is from his book, The Desert War. The Germans designed what appears to be the best petrol container for the desert. Flat, solidly built, holding 5 gallons, it could be used over and over again, known to us as a jerrycan. The great bulk of the army was forced to stick to the old flimsy 4-gallon container. The majority only used once. We could put a couple of petrol cans in the back of a truck. 2 hours of bumping over the desert rocks usually produced a suspicious smell. Sure enough, we would find both cans had leaked. Now, there's all different sorts of reports that were done at the time that there was an estimate about 1/3 of the fuel was being lost just through leakage in trying to transport it around. And back to that word logistic, if you've had to ship this, if you've had to then try and manoeuvre it in some manner up to the frontline troops, all that energy and effort going with 1/3 of it being lost just in sheer wastage and leakage on that route, that's pretty appalling as a figure. So they were obviously looking for better ways of being able to do this. And when we see the German jerrycan, this seems to be a great answer to the problem. So as soon as a jerrycan was captured, it was returned into use in British or Commonwealth service. So on to the jerrycan. This dates back to 1935 when the German military actually say we're going to need a new petrol container. So they go to industry, and there's a company, because forgive me, I'm going to read this one because I'm always going to say it wrong, the Muller Engineering Company in 1937. Their chief engineer, and again forgive me if I don't say his name right, Vincenz Grünvogel, he's the guy that comes up with the design that becomes the jerrycan. And the idea is he's looking at it as a problem in the sense that they're going to go for something like it's about 4.5 gallons, the metric 20 litres that they're going for. And his design is very, very clever because it looks simplistic, but it's got a number of very sophisticated features that, again, some of you will know all this, but if you don't know it, you just think, well, it's just a can, isn't it? Well, no, it's not. They've thought this through very, very cleverly. And in 1936, they produce about 5,000 that go out for trials. It kind of gets its first public airing as a new bit of equipment in the 1938, and yet it starts being seen in the photographs, etc. But just to have a look at what he's come up with as a design, just looking here, this is actually a British wartime jerrycan. Sorry about the state of it, I just dug it out of the garage. This is a British copy, 1945 dated one. But the idea is the sophistication that we're looking at. So what we get, the indentations, and you've got slightly different versions on different companies, those ridges and rivets, as it were, they're put together so that it strengthens that big sheet that's being stamped out of pressed steel. And by stamping in these indentations, it's giving it more strength, and it's also giving it more surface area to be able to contract into if it gets cold, or expand into if it gets hot. Because, so again, straight away, these are going to all different climates, different temperatures, different times of the day. That's going to affect the volume inside. So that stamping was done that way. Another very clever thing the Germans had worked out was if you actually do the seal down here, this seal is actually not proud of the edging if you look at it flat on, so that doesn't get damage in the same way that if the seal was down an edge. So that idea that there's obviously more pressure there, more chance of it being hit, burst, etc. So by doing that seal in a recessed ridge when they're putting it together, that means it's got much more protection to it. And again, they've cornered, all the edges are cornered. On a lot of the flimsies, there's squarer edging there, which of course is much more open to, when it's impacted, splitting damage than a rounded edge is going to be. Other features that were thought through very carefully. So instead of a screw cap here, I think this one's, yeah, it's rusted solid. I won't be able to open it at the moment, but you can see on the side there, you lift this up, that flips up the top of the cap there. Inside that cap, there's a tiny top piece that funnels away, so oxygen can still get in as you're pouring the material, the petrol that's inside, out. So you can actually pour that out from that funnel that way without necessarily having to have a spout, so it's not doing that classic glug, glug, glug. The handles, again, are designed very specifically with a view that they're higher than the normal fueling point. You'd stop fueling, obviously, when it gets to the bottom of the neck here, which means you've still got air in the can, like this raised area at the top here. And that means the air that's still left in the can and through the handles, if you drop a full jerry can into water, there's enough air in there to be able to make it float still. So another one of those features that you're going to be able to save your fuel if you end up having a flood, or it's going down on a ship or something, either any luck, you should be able to save the fuel can. Now another feature, which I will move my product placement, my nice tank mug you can get from the shop. Here's another jerry can. Another feature is why those handles are done in the same way, so that you can carry 2 empty jerry cans with one hand by having those at the side. The other feature you can do is if it's a full one and you're carrying it almost like human chain style, you can have one person's hand on that one, the other person's hand to help you carry them, whoops, like this. So you're going along and you're being able to use those handles in that manner. So it's another one of those features that, again, was very cleverly thought through at the time. And the British, as I mentioned, we start using the jerry can captured ones as soon as we possibly could, and then they move on to manufacturing in Britain. And they actually had a factory in the Far East as well, where they were starting to manufacture these, and we use them and use them and use them because they're such an obviously good feature, good simple design, but with a number of sophisticated levels to it. So they're very effective piece of kit. The Americans start manufacturing as well, and they end up going for a screw cap. Criticisms, pluses and minuses there. Their arguments for the screw cap, by the way, was it was the same type of screw cap that we'd got on those bigger drums of fuel that you'd be carrying around, the 200-gallon drums. And those ones, if you've got the same tooling, etc., that would make it easier. That was the argument there. And the American Marine Corps, being the Marine Corps, ended up going for their own version, which is a combination of American jerry can in the body, but having a different type of cap to the top of it, sort of thing. So you can see all this. And of course, then you've got all the different manufacturers tend to put their stamps on it. Most of them are dated. They'll have a date for the year of issue. And again, some are stamped because of the contents. It wasn't just going to be fuel. Some have a pre-stamped with things like water. Other ones, there was a convention, you painted either a white cross on it if it was only for water, because the obvious issue there is the last thing you want to do is cross-contaminate with water in fuel, or if your water is going to taste pretty foul if you ended up using a can that's been used for petrol beforehand. Now, those military cans like that were used in vast quantities in the Second World War. I found an estimate that they reckon about 21 million of those were made. There was always that issue about when you travel with fuel in bulk, how do you put it all together? When you're getting nearer the front line, obviously that idea about splitting up your risk factors. So do you put some jerry cans on a truck with other supplies and spread that out amongst a truck fleet if your one petrol bowser gets hit? These are all the sorts of issues that logistics or the logisticians have to look into to see what is the best way of transporting things like fuel. And in the end, despite Allied efforts, by October of 1944, even though we were using some quite sophisticated systems, they were still transporting 1 million gallons of fuel a day from the D-Day beaches all the way through, or one or two of the ports captured, all the way through up to the front line. And the vast majority of that was being taken forward in jerry cans. Now, for the frontline troops, there was all that issue. What do you do with the empty jerry can? You're supposed to backload it. Quite often, the guys in their advances forwards didn't always do that. They'd sometimes, leave them by the side of the road, sling them in a hedge, do whatever, to the point that the American military asked French school children to collect them, and they was prizes for the kids who got the most and everything. And they estimate about 1 million jerry cans were collected by French school kids and handed back in that way as a way of keeping them therefore in circulation and used. Now, that word jerry can, where's the word come from? The British use the word because we had the word for the Germans, called them jerrys. That stems back from a lot more before World War II. There is a thought that it's from the First World War, and I brought this one out to, you might wonder why I brought a Poe out. This is the sort of thing you kept under the bed in old days to, if you were caught short in the night. This in Britain was called a Poe or a jerry. And if you think about it, there was a thought that it might be that upside down looks a little bit like a German helmet, which is why we started calling them jerrys even in the First World War. So that's maybe one of the reasons why the word jerry comes along. Again, there's another theory, jerry built. It doesn't mean very well put together in Britain. If jerry built, it could have been that word. But anyway, the common term jerry was what in Britain we were using for the Germans, and that word, so it was a German's can, hence a jerry can, and that word seemed to stuck, and it's still being used all around the world today. Now, of course, end of the 60s, into the 70s, the metal jerry can tends to start getting replaced by plastic versions. This is a fairly modern one. This is a Dutch Army one, Netherlands there, water. I was told that actually these are being made, there we go, this one's actually made in Canada. And this is black plastic. It's actually, I will say, I nearly said polyurethane. It's not. They're actually made from a material that's nowadays, it's called polyethylene. And that's a very dense, heavy plastic, very durable, and obviously it doesn't rust and everything. Jerry cans, by the way, they had a plastic liner in, or they were painted on the inside to stop that rusting feature. But these ones, presumably cheaper to make as well, and they can last a good time. But there's lots of other methods now. The jerry can is still being used, obviously, for many different functions in militaries around the place to keep supplies going forward, to keep water on a vehicle, keep emergency fuel supply. But one of the other big things that comes around now is they've got this idea of, they've actually called it they're up to, I think it's a Mark V portable fuel bowser. And it's one of these massive, great big, it's about 3.5 foot across diameter. They're these great big rubber looking black balls that have been slung beneath a helicopter. They've got Kevlar in them as well, which is good protective. And that will carry a couple of tons of fuel, and it can be dropped down by a helicopter quite easily, simply, and off you go. And there's a fuel point on the side of it. So nowadays, very different methods for sometimes getting that fuel around the place. You'll see all these huge, great big petrol bowsers. There is still that fundamental problem, though, is a petrol bowser is absolutely okay for mobile warfare until you get into certain types of combat zones. And if that's the only way that you're going to get fuel forward, they are hugely vulnerable vehicles to very simple types of attack. So again, how you can distribute the fuel, how you might have to spread it about a little bit so at least some of it will get through. If you can't have that risk of your one key supply chain being broken down because of the loss of those bowsers, etc. That's the sort of thing logistics people still have to talk to this day. So there's a little bit there on petrol cans, the ones I've managed to find at home in the garage, etc. Little bit of information there on logistics as well. And again, this is just a first attempt at doing this type of thing. So if you've got other ideas of subjects we might be able to talk to you about, do keep coming back on the comments, and we'll be doing these. At the moment, it's a beautiful spring day here in England at the moment. So we're making the most of it, sitting outside. Probably won't be able to do this all the time, but we hope you found that a little bit of interest. We are a charity here at the Tank Museum, so if you can support us, please do. Consider joining our Patreon scheme or becoming a member of the Friends. Any donations will go directly towards the Tank Museum and its activities.